People that have gone to jail or prison or worked there, what are your most interesting, funny, scary, or gross stories? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. I've worked in a prison for some time in medical. What surprised me more than anything else is how many inmates have serious mental illnesses and below normal IQ. Like, no matter how bad and common you may think it is, it's really bad and even more common. A lot of them don't even belong in prison. They definitely shouldn't be out on the street, but they and society would benefit a lot more from keeping them in an environment when they can get real treatment. Prison makes them so much worse. I'll tell you a story. One time, one such inmate was having a fit and asking to speak to someone from behavioral health. Well, it was night shift and we didn't have any BH professionals on duty at the time, so I agreed to go talk to him. He was black male in his 30s, past violent offender. It turned out that he was angry because he had gotten moved from one cell to another and his radio had gotten damaged and some of his stuff was missing. He was frustrated and didn't feel like he was getting an explanation. The inmate thought it was because everyone hated his music. They always be complaining about my music and that's why they broke my radio, he said. And to emphasize the point, he turned the radio on full blast with one of Duran Duran's songs playing. When he turned it off after a few seconds, I remarked, "Well, I think that's outrageous. Who would have a problem with Duran Duran?" That got him. "You like Duran Duran?" "Oh yeah, my sister was the biggest fan in the 80s, played them all the time, which means I was listening too." The inmate's mood changed, and he showed me his property from that had everything and asked me to verify that the radio was recorded as undamaged on the form. As I looked at it, I noticed that he had a box of crayons listed among his property. I asked him what sorts of things he draws and colors. The inmate pulled out a folder containing some blank coloring pages that he had of various things. I saw one picture of an owl and mentioned that I like owls. He told me he'd color it for me. "I'll tell you what then, if you will promise to color that owl for me, I will come back tomorrow and visit you to see how you're doing. Deal?" He agreed to do it. The next day I showed up and the guy was absolutely jubilant. The owl was perfectly colored and he insisted that I take it. He couldn't stop talking about it either, and he remarked somewhere in the middle, "All my life, my folks told me not to trust white people, but you did what you said you would." It was such a small damn thing, and it mattered to this man to the point that it made him question the negativity that may have led him to the hard place he found himself in. I will never forget how happy he was right then. For my part, I still have that owl picture hanging on my refrigerator. My time to shine. In my younger days, I may or may not have spent some time in county jail. Time served, never actually went to prison. Now, this country jail was severely over capacity, so much so that the mess area was used as overflow, and about 40 of us had to sleep on bunk beds they'd plopped down in the middle of this big room. Unfortunately, this area had no toilets of its own, so they left one cell open and unoccupied for a toilet for all of us. Bad jail food, 40 dudes, one toilet. Not a movie anyone wants to see. Well, I dropped approximately 1/5 of my body weight into that poor toilet in one extremely dense log. This, much to the chagrin of the guys on the bottom floor cells, caused all of their toilets to back up somehow, flooding their cells with shit water. The guards made us wait outside in the exercise area while plumbers came in. This all happened at like 11:30 at night, in January. No one knows it was me that clogged it all up, which is probably a good thing. TL, DR, got poop water all over a bunch of literal felons. My dad used to work at the Spring Hill Penitentiary in Nova Scotia. He worked in a unit that was using an experimental approach to rehabilitation called a living unit, where the guards wore street clothes and the cells weren't locked. One night, he was doing his rounds and he heard a noise in a cell. When he shone his light in the cell, there were two guys having an anal adventure. He looked at them and said, "What are you doing?" The guy on the bottom looked up and said, "Minimum of 5 for armed robbery." Nice. I work on a criminal forensic unit in the Psych hospital. Most gross story I have is a guy who smuggled in a razor blade and managed to cut himself. Deep cuts, could see the bone and tendons. I remember holding his arm closed so the bleeding would stop. The guy ended up dying on the ward. The smell of iron in the air stayed for the next 2 days. Effing visible memories, man. 6 months county jail. I never went to the big leagues. Every other arrest was Maine, overnights, weekends, and another very short county stint. Anyways, I was on kitchen duty, and they have outside employees as well working in the kitchen. Every single utensil hung on a board in locked cabinets. They were huge, and there were 3 of them. We cleaned up after each meal, and every single utensil had to be put away, and then the COs checked to make sure there were no missing spaces. Then we went back to the dorms, big rooms filled with bunks that held like 40. After dinner, there was a potato peeler missing. The guards make us look for it. We go through trash everywhere, and it doesn't show up. They say we can't go back until it's found. So once again, we look, and they have us looking behind everything and looking in places that you would have to hide or throw something into to get it there. Still find nothing. Now they are pissed. They say that there will be no repercussions if whoever has it will just drop it. The CEOs even walk away to give the person a chance to drop it. Still nothing. And at this point, guys are pissed and saying whoever has it to drop it so we can all go. The guards are heated and are threatening everyone now. Finally, at like 1 a.m., they let us go back to the dorms with the promise that we are all accountable when it shows up. Next day, it's like nothing happened. Turned out a lady who worked there had accidentally taken it with her back to their locker room and didn't realize it. She was fired. Had a cell to myself till a big group came in, all arrested at the same time. Big Dog told me I was sitting on his bunk. I politely told him I just wrecked a car I loved. My head went through the windshield and I had the worst headache ever. In short, was having a bad night. So, we'd share and both sit up on the bed, or we could fight over it, and his night was about to get as bad as mine was. His call. He laughed. His boys laughed. As when breakfast trays were passed out, they realized I couldn't eat dry food because my bottom teeth went through my bottom lip in the wreck. So, next thing I hear after giving up my box of cereal was this same kid yelling down to the other holding cell to his buddies to toss down any milk or OJ they weren't drinking. My man here can't chew. There was a shakedown in one of the pods and a couple of stewards were sent to D-pod for contraband. What was the offending item? A loaf of bread they swiped from the dinner cart. Seems like a sad tale, right? Just 2 fellas looking for a scrap of food. Well, it sure as hell wasn't for snacking on. The 2 had smushed a hole in the end of the loaf. I cannot say for certain what brand of bread, but I'd like to think they named her Sarah Lee. I got arrested for DWI when I was young. They gave my passenger a ride to the station. While waiting for his ride, he asked to use the restroom. They took him to a cell and left him. They set a court date for him, and when he showed up, the judge had no idea why he was there. I was in jail for only a few days and was in a pod with about 30 other women. On my first day, a fellow inmate announced that it was time for arts and crafts and taught the new girls how to make homemade tampons. Not very sanitary, but man was it entertaining. The things they came up with to pass the time, very creative. Honestly, not many dull moments, just shitty food and unsanitary living conditions. A friend told me this story. He was in minimum security prison and lived in a building called a guild, essentially a large bunkhouse with 4 rows of bunks with a 5-foot cement wall running down the middle to divide the middle 2 rows. The guy on the other side of the wall from him had smuggled in a DVD player and some porn movies. My friend's buddy used to always come over to his bunk area and lean over the wall to watch when the other guy was watching porn. One day the other guy saw him doing this and said, "Hey man, why don't you just come over and sit down?" My friend's buddy shook his head and said, "Nah, I'd like it better like this. It feels like I'm looking in somebody's window." I was only in jail once, for a few hours to get processed and assigned a court date. They gave out these bologna sandwiches that nobody ate because, well, they were gross jail bologna sandwiches. One guy was asking for all the uneaten sandwiches like he was hoarding up some kind of jail currency he could barter with later. I remember he was sitting there on the concrete floor surrounded by stacks of bologna sandwiches with an excited look on his face like, "I'm rich." It was only one day, part of a succession of very short internships to show us various places where psychologists work. Well, the day in the prison, there's the low security guys with the ambiance basically like a kindergarten. Most of them seem to be there due to mental issues or violence. Then there's the medium security guys, actually more serious, but we didn't stay around them a lot. They apparently are mostly short-term prisoners who are there for mostly non-physical crimes like scams, fraud, etc., etc. Then there's the high security guys, the aisle actually looking like it's from an American show. Some big angry dudes slamming the hell out of the gates. Then you see 5 guys in a corner with laptops. What are they doing there? I ask. Oh, they play League of Legends. They sit there because it's where the Wi-Fi is best. Right after I was born, my mom took a job as a correctional officer at an all-male prison or jail, can't remember, in our small town in Missouri. One day, one of the inmates whispered to her that the spiders in his stomach were telling him to eat her. I don't know if this story is interesting, funny, or scary, depends on your perspective, but I was in a pod once where we had a regular CO who was a complete piece of shit. He used to try to provoke inmates into starting a fight so that he and his buddies could kick the shit out of the inmate. He would destroy inmates' belongings for no reason. He ripped up a letter from my dad during a search one time and then bragged to me that he did it. He would fuck with inmates' food. He was complete trash. He thought he was a big, tough dude. So anyway, there were a lot of young gang guys in the pod. Gangs are really good at communicating within facilities. So the gang managed to somehow find out the name of the CO's kids and communicate that to the pod. So one day, the CO came to do his shift, and the pod spent the whole time casually name-dropping the kids' names into the general conversation while he was walking by. And that was the last day the CO worked in our pod. Aren't jails just great for reform? I've been out of prison for a decade as of July 5th, 2021. Congrats. Once was enough for me, even if it took 5 years to realize it. I was young, barely 18, and ended up one of the gladiator camps in Texas, the Roach unit. From there, I ended up in administrative segregation on the Allard unit for close to 3 years, until I discharged my entire sentence, a riot against the guards. Seg is nuts. On a best-case scenario, you spend 23 hours a day completely alone and an hour in a small cage that is open to the sky. That rarely happens because staying out of trouble with the guards is hard. Realistically, you just spend 24 hours a day alone for years on end. The craziest thing I saw in my time in segregation, the guards are often corrupt and malicious. With the rate of illegal contraband alone, you can't really argue it. One of the sergeants decided not to feed 2 black guys. At first, he skipped them for a meal, then a full day. Both of these guys had life sentences, one for robbery that led to someone dying, one for murdering his children. They were all out of Fs. They coordinated with the rest of the people on our run. Each run had 14 cells, 7 below, 7 on the second floor, to make noise all night. So, we all pounded on our doors, yelled, whatever, basically all night. The guards can't really do much to stop something like that other than yell. While we all made noise, these 2 guys jumped on the steel tables bolted to their walls till they busted off. Then, they used the tables to hammer on their door frame at the bottom, breaking them off the tracks. Nobody noticed because, again, the guards basically just ignore your existence back there. So, lunchtime comes. The sergeant shows up with 2 COs. An inmate on the second floor called them to a cell door. While they talked to him, the other 2 guys pushed their doors open. The sergeant saw them coming up the stairs and must have realized how close to dying he was, because he jumped over these 2 guys and tumbled down the stairs and ran out of the run and slammed the door shut. He locked his 2 men in with these guys, and it went bad. The guards didn't die, since they weren't who they were after, but they got effed up bad. Eventually, the teams showed up and shot so many grenades into our run that the nurses couldn't come into there for 2 weeks from the residue. The sergeant got fired for abandoning his guys, the 2 guys got beat half to death, and the rest of us choked on tear gas for 2 weeks. I almost met SPM a couple times on Allred, but that's a story for another day.